returned from exile after the fall of the Shah in 1979, there were high hopes for the country's future. But it soon became clear the supreme religious leader would govern by harsh rules in an Islamic republic. Abul Hassan Bani Sadr was appointed president by Khomeini in the early days, when the Ayatollah decided to use terror as a way of enforcing the Islamic Revolution. 15 years after fleeing Iran in fear of his own life, President Bani Sadr remains a prisoner in his own home in France. Even a walk in the garden poses a major security problem for the French forces who guard him. Mr. Bani Sadr maintains a network of contacts in Iran. He's well informed about the way the regime works.
The regime carries out two types of terror. One to frighten members of the regime itself, and the other to prevent the opposition from getting strong. Everything must focus on this issue. The regime can only continue its existence through an atmosphere of fear.
From the start, Khomeini's regime targeted dissidents who had fled Iran wherever they went, and increasingly in Europe. Shahriar Shafiq, the Shah's nephew, killed in Paris in 1979. Gholam Aliovezi, former military governor of Tehran, shot in Paris in 1984. Ali Nabavi Tavokoli, a Shah supporter, shot in London in 1987. In Khomeini's first decade in power, 17 people were assassinated in Europe, dozens seriously wounded. In 1989, Salman Rushdie was declared a blasphemer by Khomeini. His book, The Satanic Verses, outraged many Muslims across the world. Passions ran high. The Ayatollah sentenced Mr. Rushdie to death with a fatwa. A Tehran religious foundation offered $1 million to anyone who would kill the British author.
In the day I heard about the Khomeini fatwa, it did strike me that I might only have a day or two to live. It struck me almost immediately. My first reaction was to shut the shutters and lock the door. And really, I was in no sense underestimated the power of Khomeini to kind of stretch his finger across the world like a kind of lottery commercial, you know, and say, it's you. And that in a way, is the brilliance of the fatwa, you know, is the invention of a completely new form of terrorism, kind of remote control terrorism. You know, you just point at somebody across the world and offer a sum of money and a place in heaven.
It was 2 days before Iran's ambassador was summoned to the Foreign Office. British hostages were being held by pro-Iranian groups in the Lebanon, and the rebuke was very delicately worded.
Plainly, one must be very deeply concerned about events of that kind, but one has to try to maintain a sense of perspective and impress upon the other country the possible harm that can be done by incidents of this kind.
I'm sure that the initial instruction was, oh, well, you'd better keep him alive, but don't do him any favors. And so, I mean, it was 4 years before I met any British politician. They simply wanted to behave as if I didn't exist and treat it as they say, as a procedural issue of police, as an operational issue, which the police would make the decisions about, and simply not take it up as a political issue at all.
Well, the British government knew that it had to defend his right to free speech and defend his right to continue his life. You can't have him murdered on... but at the same time, they recognized that his book was especially offensive to Muslims and that this was a problem, not only with those who issued the fatwa, but with other trading partners of the British abroad and with Muslims inside the UK. Also, they would see that having to eliminate this fatwa was going to cause problems, direct problems, for British relations with Iran.
Khomeini died later that year, but under his hardline successor, Ayatollah Khamenei, the fatwa continued, and so did the terror. Abdul Rahman Kasemlu, a Kurdish leader assassinated in Vienna in 1989. Dr. Kazem Rajavi, a former UN ambassador, shot in Geneva a year later. And Dr. Shapur Bakhtiar, the Shah's first prime minister. His head was hacked off in Paris. A common theme began to emerge. Many of the killers were suspected of having links with the Iranian embassy in Germany. Iran and Germany enjoyed close relations. Dr. Veliati, the foreign minister, was always warmly welcomed by Klaus Kinkel, his German counterpart. At the time, Germany was the Islamic Republic's #1 trade partner, with contracts worth £1.5 billion annually. In return, Iran was allowed to build up its Bonn embassy to become the biggest in Europe. And some say there were other links.
The Germans gave facilities and training to the Iranian Secret Service. Germany had turned into a center for them. Germany became Iran's most important business partner in Europe and the center for the Iranian intelligence service.
Mr. Kinkel's support for Mr. Rushdie was not quite so fulsome. Publicly, he argued the author's case, but behind the scenes, it was clear Germany wouldn't do anything to jeopardize its relations with Iran.
I've sat and listened to Klaus Kinkel say to me that he can't change the foreign policy of Germany for the sake of one man. And I mean, frankly, inaccurate remark, since the issue involved has not to do with me in a way. I just happen to be the location of the issue. The issue has to do with threats against many other people, with European businesses, you know, publishers, booksellers, and it has to do with high matters of principle, which, of course, politicians try not to talk about.
The Germans have to import most of their energy, and see Iran as one source for that, and have also developed investments there and debts there which they cannot afford to turn their back on. And they have managed to do reschedule debt servicing arrangements with the Iranians, and this has worked out satisfactorily. And so they've got stakes in Iran, and they've been able to do business with Iran, and they have trade with Iran.
On a September night in 1992, however, the Germans were to discover their Iranian friends had a less friendly face. Just before midnight, as one group of men met in the Mykonos restaurant, others made preparations. Their target, Dr. Sharaf Kandi, a Kurd campaigning for independence for his people in Iran. Two masked men burst in.
As soon as I saw that shooting was going on and that the man's face was masked, I realized that an assassination was taking place. I instinctively jumped back and hid under the table. At the same time, Fatah Abdoli fell beside me. His head was about 50 to 60 centimeters away from mine. He'd been shot. His mouth was full of blood, and he was taking his last breath.
To the eyewitness cowering under the table, it was clear the assassins wanted to ensure that Dr. Sharaf Kandi was dead. They put a pistol to his head. There was no doubt about the killer's identity.
As the man began firing, he swore in Farsi. I've no choice but to repeat what he said. He said, "Mother."
The killers made their escape, leaving 4 men dead on the floor. Dr. Sharaf Kandi, 2 aides and their translator, Nuri Dekordi. As Mr. Dekordi's widow buried her husband in a Berlin cemetery, the German public expressed outrage that political exiles who thought they'd be safe in Germany had been gunned down.
My husband was a very quiet person, the sort of person who knew a lot about everything. He liked to read, to know, and to write about everything. In the last years of his life, he was trying to find a peaceful solution to the troubles in Iran.
Within a month of the killings, 3 Lebanese men were under arrest and an Iranian with links to the Bonn embassy. He was charged with masterminding the operation. As the state prosecutor set to work, the Iranian embassy stayed open, trade continued, diplomatic relations remained friendly. The next year, in Norway, the Iranians showed they were prepared to target anyone who offended their regime. In Oslo, someone had taken a stand. The publisher William Nygaard held a party. The surprise guest, Salman Rushdie. The fatwa extended to anyone who helped publish the satanic verses, but William Nygaard organised a high-profile launch for the book. It was held in the company's mansion, a writer's retreat just a few doors away from the Iranian embassy in Oslo.
The police were pretty much concerned, but from my personal point of view, I was not very much concerned, to be honest. We did not believe that there should be any kind of risk on a personal level.
But as the publisher left his home one Monday morning, someone was waiting. Mr. Nygaard noticed his car had a puncture. He pulled out his mobile phone to call for help. As he leant on his car, he felt a sudden jolt.
Then I just by sudden felt terrible electrical shock, I thought, if I at all was able to react. But it hurted a lot. And it took maybe 1 second, maybe 2 seconds, then another electrical shock was felt in my, I think that must have been here in my shoulder. The first one was definitely lower in my back. And then I really started screaming and running to hide myself of this kind of risk again.
William Nygaard was shot again in the back before collapsing. The assailant got away. It wasn't till he reached hospital that Mr. Nygaard learnt it wasn't an electrical shock, but an attempt to kill him.
A very serious doctor came up to me. Mr. Nygaard, we had to tell you. Maybe you don't understood this, that in fact, you have been shot 3 times. And you are seriously wounded. We hope that you will survive.
Analysis of the scene revealed there were probably 2 people in the hit squad. One of them fired the weapon. A witness helped produce a photo fit of the gunman, a person of Middle Eastern appearance. Attention immediately focused on the Iranian embassy. Their staff had been overheard discussing Nygaard in the local Muslim community, and 2 men came under suspicion. A Syrian man questioned by the Norwegian police admitted he had friends at the Iranian embassy and they'd asked him to spy on William Nygaard. And a Pakistani man was questioned about a gun which he owned, a .44 Magnum, the same type as used in the attack. He'd left Oslo for Tehran just 1 day after the shooting. Suspicion then centred on the chief of security at the Iranian embassy in Oslo. He too left the country around the time of the shooting and never returned. Mr. Nygaard has no doubt the embassy was behind the attempt to kill him.
They have been involved in the planning, involved in the execution, involved in bringing that guy, or maybe those 2, to Norway, covering them during the hours they've been staying here, and also bringing them out again. Everything has been organized by certain persons in the embassy.
In the absence of hard proof, Norway maintained its relations with Iran, despite Mr. Nygaard's lobbying. But the government did persuade the Iranian ambassador to write a letter pledging to refrain from any act which violated the ethics of diplomatic behaviour. Mr. Nygaard wanted tougher action.
I would, of course, like to kick them out and break up the diplomatic relationship, because I don't like to have more or less as neighbors people who like to murder me the whole time.
William Nygaard became the third victim associated with the Satanic Verses. Hitoshi Igarashi, Rushdie's Japanese translator, had been stabbed to death in 1991. And Ettore Capriolo, the Italian translator, had been attacked in Milan the same year, but survived.
How bad do things have to get? I mean, who has to be killed before Europe starts deciding that enough is enough? I mean, clearly, 3 or 4 Kurds in a restaurant in Berlin, that's not bad enough. The knifing of an Italian translator, that's clearly not bad enough. The shooting of a Norwegian publisher, that's not bad enough. What has to happen?
At the beginning of 1996, in a remote spot in Bosnia, activities at a farmhouse attracted suspicion. Acting on intelligence, British, French and American troops enforcing the International Bosnian Peace Treaty raided the house. Panorama has obtained footage of the raid which has never been seen before.
This has been the trap.
Western intelligence believed that what had been going on in this house was a far cry from regular military activity and could threaten their forces. The war was officially over, but officers found a large and varied arsenal of weapons and much more besides.
This is rough because we're still going through them. About 60 weapons, including 5 rocket launchers, and a grenade launcher, AK-47, sniper rifles, and a lot of handguns.
The commander of the troops, the American Admiral Leighton Smith, went through the house room by room.
I picked up what is clearly a sniper rifle. It was a silenced rifle. There could be no other use for it. And on the table next to it were some cartridges that would have fit in that rifle very nicely, that were made specifically, I think, for terrorist-related activities, because there was no marking whatsoever on the cartridge, so that if the weapon were fired and an empty cartridge was found, there would be no way to trace it back to anyone. You can't deny that this was a weapon that would be used to surreptitiously or clandestinely kill someone.
Admiral Leighton Smith was shown more evidence. There were children's toys in the next room, packed with explosives. They were clearly experiments in making booby traps, whose target was unlikely to be military.
And the presence of that with these other toys which haven't been adulterated yet would suggest they were going to make more of those.
The circuit boards, the explosives, and the stacks of documents indicated the farmhouse was in reality a school for training in terror.
They have been training here for some time. We've got lists of all the students.
The camp had been in operation for 2 years. Hundreds of Bosnians had passed through it. But it was the documents left behind that really provided the most direct evidence yet. Many of the papers were written in Farsi, the Iranian language. Amongst them were instructors' manuals with diagrams of how to wire up bombs. There were exam papers on assassination, blackmail, bombing, sabotage and kidnapping, and a detailed account on how to use poisons, chemicals and biological toxins like botulism, including the killing dose. A videotape was discovered featuring an Iranian instructor. He is encouraging his men with a religious exhortation. He is seen training the Bosnians to carry out what seems to be a hit operation.
I don't know too many people who drive around in a car and then everybody jumps out and starts shooting like crazy and then jump back in. When you look at a tape like that, you can only draw the conclusion that they're going to drive up somewhere, jump out of the car, and they're going to wipe somebody out, and they're going to jump back in the car and take off again. I don't know how you can escape that.
May I see your documents, please? Passport.
Ali Ashgar Ali Shahi was one of 3 Iranians captured at the farmhouse during the raid. He produced diplomatic papers accrediting him to the embassy in Sarajevo.
That is magic.
His 2 Iranian colleagues also had diplomatic passports. They were all handed over to their embassy with instructions to get them out of Bosnia. 8 Bosnians were also arrested at the house. Their government claimed it was just a regular military training base, a natural consequence of the war in the Balkans, in which Iran had actively supported the Bosnian side. The Bosnians denied that terror training was going on at the farm, but those who saw the evidence just don't believe it.
What I was looking at was incontrovertible evidence. I mean, absolutely no doubt about it. Airplane tickets, lesson plans, drawings, weapons, photographic development center, makeup room. All of these things were clear. I mean, they were there. I saw them with my own eyes.
And what did they add up to?
Well, the only conclusion you can draw is that they were being taught how to be terrorists.
Just 10 days later, terror was in the headlines again, this time in Israel, where 4 bombs exploded, killing 57 people. Hamas, the Palestinian group opposed to the peace process, used suicide bombers and targeted Jerusalem's buses. This is Hassan Salameh, the mastermind behind the attacks. He was captured by the Israelis as he tried to escape through a roadblock. The explosives expert is now incarcerated in the high-security Shikma prison, where he has spoken about the planning and the execution of the bomb attacks.
The bomb is a suitcase. You put 13 kilos of TNT in it, and you connect them through electric wires, and you fit an electric switch, a button. And the person who is supposed to carry it to the site knows about it. And when he gets there, he presses the button, and the explosion takes place.
Salameh revealed that yet again there was an Iranian connection. He'd been taught to build a bus bomb at another secret camp, this time in Iran itself.
They were Iranian instructors. It was someplace in Iran. I don't know where. I never left the camp. The faction had some connections to have me trained there.
Two weeks after the bus bombs, an Iranian ship, the Commandos, docked in Antwerp in Belgium. Customs officers here have to pinpoint suspect cargo amongst 4,000 containers unloaded each day. They cross-check the origins and movements of each ship. Last March, they picked on the Commandos. The Commandos had come directly from an Iranian port, fully laden, and offloaded just one of her containers at Antwerp. It was packed with pickles and olives and something else.
We opened one wooden box. In it, we found a steel cylinder. There was a hole in that cylinder, and some packages wrapped in plastics were in that hole. And when we opened such one of those packets, we found an ignition tube.
An army bomb disposal team were immediately brought in to investigate further. They found a specially designed mortar with a range of over half a mile which could penetrate walls. It was made in sections to be assembled quickly on site, and it had a sophisticated fuse to deliver a powerful mid-air explosion. 9 months later, mortars identical to the one found in Antwerp were seized in Baghdad. They were aimed at the main Iranian opposition group, which is based in Iraq. One hit a hospital, killing a man and injuring many others.
The use of these super mortars has been a very qualitative and a dramatic change in the dimensions of the terrorism of the mullahs. So far, 5 of these mortars have either been discovered or have been used. But what is very important is that some of these mortars are already have been dispatched to outside Iran, and they can be in any European capital right now.
The container unloaded in Antwerp, in which the mortar was hidden, was addressed to an Iranian company in Munich. The ship itself, the Commandos, ended up in Hamburg, where 2 Iranian intelligence officers on board were questioned by the German police, but later released. No one knows for sure who was the target of the Antwerp mortar. It could have gone from here by road to anywhere in Europe. But the destination of the ship and the rest of its cargo indicated that the trail led once more to Germany. Last month in Berlin, after a 4-year investigation into the Mykonos restaurant murders, the court met to pass judgment. For months, under tight security, judges had taken evidence from the accused and from Germany's intelligence services. And most sensationally, the court heard from Iran's former president, who gave details of the vast bureaucracy that plans and supports terror operations in Europe. Sanctioned, he claimed, by the very top officials of the regime.
Copies of the completed plan will be sent to Mr. Khamenei and Mr. Rafsanjani. If Mr. Khamenei signs it, he will issue an order to the team leader. Mr. Rafsanjani also signs the governmental side of it. After they have both signed it, the plan can be carried out. 16 organizations have been created in different government departments. At the head of each is one of these terror networks. They coordinate and carry out each terrorist activity, and when the work is finished, they clean up the evidence. This is the general system I told the court about.
For the first time, there was hard evidence pointing to the Tehran regime. A government-issue pistol and a confession by one of the accomplices detailing the plot. He overheard the Iranian gunman who escaped saying, "Iran is behind us." The testimony given by Bani Sadr and another defector clinched the case. An Iranian intelligence officer, Qasim Darabi, who posed as a greengrocer in Berlin, was found guilty of masterminding the killings and sentenced to life imprisonment. But even more remarkable was the judge's conclusion that the regime's top officials, Supreme Religious Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and President Rafsanjani, ordered the killings. The intelligence minister, Ali Falahian, the court decided, was delegated to execute the plan. The true face of the Tehran government had at last been exposed, according to the thousands of Iranian exiles who gathered outside the court. For years, Europe had all but ignored the murders of so many in their community. Amongst those who celebrated was Parvis Dasmalchi, who had miraculously escaped with his life 5 years ago in the Mykonos restaurant.
This verdict is a major achievement because it names the committee and those responsible. The top-ranking Iranian leaders, both political and religious, have been revealed as having been the people who issued the orders for these murders.
In Iran, there was no shame or apology. The government went on the offensive with protests and threats outside the German embassy. Officials denied any state role in the killings. We asked the Iranian government to talk to us about the Mykonos verdict, but they failed to respond. After the German court verdict, the European Union withdrew its ambassadors from Iran in protest. But just 2.5 weeks later, they decided the diplomats could return to Tehran. Critics argued that yet again, Europe had appeased the regime. The old policy of critical dialogue with Iran was abandoned. But Europe refused to impose any kind of financial sanctions or to curtail its trade links.
The way the Europeans were then conducting themselves was trying to find a way to show enough concern, enough disapproval, enough anxiety to the Iranians that this sort of situation could not be repeated, but at the same time not to jeopardize their relations with Iran.
So business as usual?
I think the thinking has been that a demonstration must be made to the Iranians and then give it 2-3 months and it'll be business as usual.
I think what Europe has displayed here is a degree of cynicism that I would not have believed them capable of. But that's to say, what this is about is not wanting to do anything to rock the great boat of greed and money.
A life under guard is still in prospect for Salman Rushdie. Security and careful planning